success mean for you? It's a small and at the same time, I think, a very, very big question. So when you think about that for yourself, what comes to mind? What's your first association? Does it have something to do with contentment, with happiness, with reaching your goals, with collaboration with other people? What does it really mean for you? I guess for many people, goals come to mind, and that's also kind of our starting point for the discussion today. This talk is about OKRs, and at the same time, it's a lot about your definition of success. And so what I want to share with you today is why your definition of success matters when it comes to how you work with goal frameworks like OKRs, and why that especially matters when we talk about development topics like sustainability, mental health, or diversity, how to intentionally apply OKRs to these topics. And of course, I also want to share some practical examples and learnings from my own experience that I gathered over the last couple of years working with these topics in many, many different organizations. So maybe a quick word about myself so you know what kind of perspective I bring to these topics. So yeah, my name is Natalija Hellesoe. I'm based in Munich. I have worked with OKRs in many different organizations over the last 5 to 6 years. So implementing them as a strategy execution, as a focus tool, but then of course also taking care of all the surrounding topics when it comes to leadership, taking over responsibility. I've got a background in transformation and HR, so agility in HR, the topic of the talk right before here, is also one of the key things that I'm concerned about, and I'm very active in the entire community because I believe all these topics, they are great, but they're also fast changing. There is so much to them. So I do monthly meetups now in the 4th year, open spaces, and love to also be at conferences like this one to share my experience, but then also learn from you and your experience and your questions. I think what is kind of my view on the topic per se, since I come from a tradition or from a transformational background, is I always look at the bigger picture of that. So for me, OKRs is not just a concept somewhere in the organization, but it's part of a bigger ecosystem. And I'm always striving to make the entire ecosystem work, even if the focus or the priority, for example, of my collaboration with clients is then OKRs. And speaking of OKRs, I guess since it's an Agile conference and OKRs is kind of a trend topic these days, I guess many of you have heard about that. But just in case there's somebody in the room who doesn't, just a 60-second introduction, what I mean by that. So when I talk about OKRs, I mean this, well, first of all, rather simple idea of having long-term goals in an organization, the daily execution on the other side, and then a goal framework that bridges the gap between these long-term goals and the daily tasks. And OKRs, so objectives and key results, do that by combining an inspiring description of the next step towards that purpose with concrete measurement criteria that look at this objective from different perspectives and measure a change in a relative or absolute value. And what I think is important to point out is that OKRs is not just a new way of defining goals, but for me, it's really essentially a new way of working with goals. So that's where the OKR cycle comes in, right? Where you start with the OKR definition, where you do regular check-ins, where you reflect back on what you've achieved so far in the end. And then you take that level of information together with the long-term goals and then formulate your hypotheses and your goals for the next iteration. That being said, let's come back to the initial question. What does success mean for you personally, but then also for your organization? So whether you're part of an organization or you're working for clients, imagine that if you would walk up to your management team these days and ask your CFO, your CTO, your CEO, your head of HR and other people, what does success mean for our organization? What kind of answer would you get? And more interestingly, would you see a red thread, a common theme, or would you get very different perspectives? So do you have already a shared understanding, or would it be different? By the way, an interesting exercise to maybe try out next week. But why do I bring that up here? I bring that up here because when we think about things like goals, like OKRs, like building goal systems, we often reduce it by looking at, okay, what is then our next priority? How can we formulate that? How can we execute that? And I invite you today to take a step back and look at other dimensions of these goals. So first of all, what do you actually value? What is really important for you in your organization? Look at your goals through the lens, whom do you optimize for? So who is then the person, the entity, the group that you're actually working towards? And how do you then optimize your goal approach to best cater to the first and second question? Let's have a quick look at them to then get kind of the turnaround to the development topics. So when you ask a question, what do you actually value? You get different answers in different organizations. One visualization I really like to use is borrowed from my colleagues of SolWorks, and they define success through different dimensions. So if you look at success, it is mainly from a profit point of view, euros, revenue, growth goals. Is it mainly from a product point of view? Or do you look at it from the lens of people, so your clients or your employees? Or are you an organization who looks at success through the lens of a purpose, a bigger contribution, for example, to society? Most of organizations I know, they don't have kind of a single answer, but it's rather a mix. But normally you can still see a clear tendency. And what you then can do is also to look into what are the answers I get? And is that reflected in the goals that we set? So if I now take a look at my strategy, my vision, my company goals, my OKRs, what do I see in these goals? So if you would present these goals to me, what kind of conclusion would I draw from them? What is actually important for you? The other dimension is, whom do you then optimize that for? So there again, there are different groups of people you can do that for. So are you mainly concerned about your client perspective and your client contentment? Is it about employee satisfaction? Are you mainly driving your goals towards shareholder contentment? Or is it a different group of, for example, the management team? And speaking of the management team, that can also be a really interesting perspective to look into how are they optimizing their goals. Because what I often see happening when I work with clients, especially with executive teams, is this. So they have different reference points. Imagine I come work with a client, they want to start working with OKRs. They also want to have OKRs on a company level, which I guess is a common theme these days. And we start getting into the discussion. What I then often find is that the leadership team and the people in the room in that executive team, they are rather optimizing for the parts. So what does that mean? We now have discussions about the needs of the sales team or the marketing team or parts of maybe the value chain, and they are arguing and optimizing for their respective kingdoms, so to speak. And so what we often end up with when we then look at our company OKRs is rather a collection of department or strategic themes instead of actually OKRs for the entire company, mirroring what is important for us as a whole right now. Of course, there are certain companies that also optimize rather for the whole, and it becomes very obvious in these discussions because that feels also from an external point of view a lot more like a shared round table, where of course they bring in the different perspectives, the different needs of, for example, the departments or parts of the value chain. But the clear priority also in the discussion is working collaboratively towards the shared vision and making sure that the overarching company goals really represent what they value as a company overall. And then they talk about finding solutions and how to best balance the needs and perspectives of the individual parts with the overarching goals, but they don't do it the other way around. So what does that have to do, especially now with development OKRs? Well, if some of you have already some experience with OKRs, that might sound familiar. So you started with OKRs, you were eager to try them out because it worked well in other companies. You maybe see a need to improve cross-collaboration or cross-functional collaboration to enhance the focus in the company. And you build an OKR system that looks a little like this, right? So this is a typical setup. You come from your long-term goals, you have company OKRs with often a sole focus on standard business KPIs, a lot of growth topics, maybe some product goals thrown into that. And then you have maybe department or team OKRs. So far, so good. But what often happens then after a cycle or 2 or 3 is that you end up in a situation where nothing has really changed for the better regarding the challenges that you were facing where you thought OKRs might help you. The strategic priorities that you at least claim to be important, like maybe sustainability, mental health, remote collaboration and such, they don't really develop forward. And there's a lot of frustration around the new framework, the new setup, the effort that you need to bring in and so on. And of course, there are many, many different ways to analyze and also improve, for example, the effort that is needed for OKR. And I don't want to dive into that today, but there is one important point, especially when it comes to the development topics. And so the question is, what is then the alternative? How can you then use OKRs in a way that best caters towards what you're trying to achieve and that especially puts these development topics in the focus? And that's what brings us to these 3 points. Because I believe if you want to intentionally use OKRs for that, you need to first really intentionally design your OKR system. So meaning the way that you work with OKRs based on what you're trying to achieve with them, so your OKR why, but also your distinct definition of success. If you bring these 2 together to then design your OKR system, you have a totally different foundation. Then at the same time, to make sure that these overarching priorities are treated accordingly. Of course, if you're actually serious about them. So I'm not talking about, the marketing effort that you do to then make a post about sustainability to somehow claim that you're engaged in the topic. But I mean, if you're really serious about making it a priority and making progress towards these topics. And at the end, I'm also going to share why I think this is actually the best starting point for an OKR implementation if you haven't started yet. So let's look at the intentional design. What some companies do when they start to work with OKRs is they think about, okay, this is a new goal setting method. Where are we right now? What's the next step? Do we need trainings? Do we need tools? Okay, how can we move forward? A much smaller group then at least thinks about, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve with OKRs? Then this whole topic of focus, cross-functional collaboration comes into play. And even less people really think about, okay, what is then the problem behind that we want to solve? And what is our hypotheses on how OKRs can help us to solve that problem? So when I'm talking about a clear OKR why, for me, we need to go through all these levels back down to the actual challenge and then test the relationship also of OKRs in order to be able to support with that problem. And that together with our definition of success forms that foundation that I was talking about. What does that though mean? It means that we always look at OKRs through the lens that the implementation of OKR is never the goal. That is kind of meaningless if you want to put it that way, because it's always just a means towards an end. And the question is towards which end for us as a company right now, and what has the most priority. And to make an example, because a lot of companies I work with, they want to enhance shared focus and cross-functional collaboration with OKRs, start out enthusiastically, and it kind of fades very, very quickly because they build their OKRs along their org chart. And I would say if this is your focus, if this is the challenge that you're trying to seek to lower, to enhance, then please never build your OKRs along your org chart. Because then you have the same effect as with cascading OKRs, that it often means that you're not actually changing anything around the way that you work, but you're actually just changing more or less the headline and some process ways of working. But this will never lead you to actually reap the desired benefits. But what it certainly will do, it will create a massive overhead that will lead to a lot of frustration. And that is the point where OKR architecture comes into play. And this topic is fortunately now more and more in also the discussion in the OKR community to look at alternatives. So for many organizations, it has been clear over the last couple of years that if I work with OKRs, this is what I built, right? So I take the org chart, at least more or less, and then decide, okay, where do we need OKRs on which level? Do we need company OKRs? Do we start maybe with departments or with parts of our organization, depending on how we are organized? But that's basically it. And in some cases, that might work very well. In many, many cases, I've seen this actually enhances your problem instead of solving it. So there are alternatives. You can start with functional or with central goals like midterm goals or company OKRs, and then build your OKR architecture around that. That might look like or end up looking a lot like your org chart with some similarities. It might look completely different than your org chart, and there's a good reason for that. And even for some organizations, it might be totally useful to think about an entirely different form of OKR architecture. For example, when you're starting to work with really autonomous teams with a lot less dependencies than a classic functional organization. This is not an either or in terms of do you choose 1, 2, or 3, but it's rather something on a sliding scale where you need to think about, do we need more of this or more of that? So what is kind of our preferred mix that would cater towards our needs that we have around OKRs? And that brings me to the point of thinking about how to integrate the different types of OKR sets. What do I mean with that? I mean that many organizations use OKRs for existing functional teams. Then some of them already experiment with shared OKR sets so that various existing teams contribute. But a lot less organizations try out to work with strategic focus OKR sets. So I mean, building virtual teams around a topic or a challenge, and then setting OKRs for that particular challenge, or also even using sub-team OKR sets that then contribute to a higher level. And I think it's really important that when you talk about the OKR architecture and how you want to work with OKRs, that you look at the full picture and not just at one variation of OKRs. What does that now mean for the development topics? What I see happening often in organization is when it comes to topics like sustainability, DEI, mental health, or hybrid collaboration, they don't really have a clear home like marketing or sales or other parts of the value chain. And so what often happens is that nobody feels like really responsible. There might have been a decision that this is a strategic priority, but they get lost somewhere on the team level. So looking back on our typical OKR system that starts with the standard business KPIs, for example, DEI or sustainability OKRs end up somewhere here, either because the marketing team took over the responsibility or a satellite function of 1 or 2 people got the responsibility or something like that. And what that leads to is that they get a lot less awareness and presence, and also that it doesn't really match what we say about the priority they have and what kind of priority they have in our goal architecture. So one way to go about that is to go back to different types of OKRs. And I want to show you one concrete example so that it gets a little more tangible on how to do that for sustainability. So one of my clients, they set a very clear priority for sustainability already in their strategy. They put that kind of on the same level as their profitability goals, saying they really want to make progress towards that. And now the question was, how can we then mirror that priority in the goal setting, in the goal architecture? So what we did is we decided to build a virtual team around that topic, not because we needed that many resources, but because we wanted to make sure that the priority is really mirrored in the goal architecture. So we decided to use strategic focus OKRs to work with that and work towards progress in that area. And so what did that look like concretely? First of all, we had a very long discussion, what does sustainability actually mean for us? Because the same as with success, all these development topics, it's totally unclear, okay, what is then in of scope, out of scope? What does that mean for us? Is it about legal regulation? Is it about carbon footprint? Is it about individual goals? What do we want with that? What is the priority? What are the dependencies and so on? So first of all, have a clear picture. What are we then actually talking about? And then go ahead and say, okay, if we want to move that topic forward, we need to define a scope or a challenge for a team. And I love the word challenge because that is something that can draw people towards it. So it's not kind of a task or responsibility that I drop onto somebody, but it's rather a challenge that I clearly define, where I then recruit people who want to deal with that challenge. And of course, in different organizations, different thing works better. But what has been kind of a clear path for me is what I want to present to you now, how you can go about that. And that would be first, make really clear what the focus of the team is. So if you build a virtual team, for example, for sustainability, is it about defining a strategy? Is it about raising awareness? Is it about collaborating with customers around it? Is it about something concrete like reducing the carbon footprint? Is there kind of an impact goal towards that, or something completely different? So have really a clear shared understanding there again. What is the focus of this team? And what I want to go in now is how can then the typical challenges that arise, what are potential solutions and how to build a team like that? Because when you start off, it will be a new topic, it will be a new team. So from my experience, it really makes sense to have a dedicated onboarding process and not just bring people together in a room and say, here, you have fun with the challenge, but really design that experience. And an easy way to do that is to, first of all, recruit voluntary team members. I think that's really a key component. Have maybe a foundational instruction around OKRs if they're not familiar with that. So something that answers the questions like, what are they? How do they work? But also, where do they fit in the overall picture with the vision, the strategy, and everything else we're doing? And also give practical examples, exercises that people can really feel what it's like to work with OKRs compared to what they have been used to so far. And once you have that as a foundation, move into the team mission. That is something that I think for the first couple of years I worked with teams like that, I totally overlooked the potential of that. But now for me, it's really a mandatory piece. So moving from, I have defined the challenge for the team into now we have a team that gives themselves really a concrete team mission. So looking into how do we make sure that we're not just a temporary alliance or a pseudo team, but that we actually have reached a state where we need each other, where we have a common goal, and we have something that we want to work towards. So that's something that I always let the team define themselves. And one way to do that is for this particular part, even if we work in a mostly remote company, for example, I bring the people together. We start off the team day with the definition of a team mission. We then reflect on roles and competencies, because I think it's important to then make kind of a matching exercise, but also look at how can we best look at what everyone contributes from a strength point of view, what they want to contribute. I have a discussion around the OKR frame. So meaning what is already clear, what is already defined that has an influence on how we can define OKRs for these topics. It could be strategic priorities, it could be the resource situation, it could be something that is in the market development. So whatever is relevant that already kind of sets the frame for how we can define OKRs. And then in the afternoon, I take 3 hours to define the first OKR sets with the team, and then do a follow-up, normally a couple of days, a week later, where we continue to finalize the OKR sets, talk about the cycle, how they want to go about check-ins, tooling, and so on. And either I take care of that, or if they already have internal OKR coaches, that's something where they take over kind of the support of the team. So what lies in that approach is one important point also. I guess for many of you at this conference, this is no news. And at the same time, it's still often overlooked, because if you start to work with virtual OKR teams, it's super important to cater towards the fact that this is a new team that starts again in the forming phase, and to have a close look at, okay, what are now the necessary prerequisites that we need to put in place that this team can actually work well towards their goals, and checking back every cycle again. So where do we think we are right now? And what do we then need also from a team development point of view to make this work? The other thing is that when you work with virtual teams, I mean, this is not an invention that OKRs bring with themselves, but you've probably already have some experience with virtual teams in other places. Often it's typically that they change direction, that then new priorities come in, that team members come and go, and so on. And what has proven to be more successful is to at least aim for semi-stable teams here. So not install them like for a 2 or 3 year basis, but at least to find a challenge that needs more than one OKR cycle, and to ideally have team members recruited that can stay for more than one OKR cycle as well, so you don't start from the beginning over and over again. And the other point is resource planning and focus for the individuals. Because once you start, for example, with functional OKRs and then you add development virtual OKRs, it can get pretty tight on the resource planning front. So what I normally do is we come up with kind of principles for the organization. For example, that people should not take part in more than 2 OKR teams to also balance kind of the effort and the actual execution power they bring in. And that one team, for example, it worked well that they had kind of a minimum limit of dedicated resources of half a day a week. Because when you end up with recruiting team members that can then only spend 1 or 2 hours a week for this particular OKR team, it doesn't really get you anywhere. And then it leads back to the frustration about all the effort that goes into the OKR cycle and not actually the execution. And last but not least, of course, the support from the leadership team is essential. So what I like to do when it comes to topic like sustainability, mental health and such is the ground principle of saying no strategic focus topic team without a management team sponsor. And for me, a management team sponsor does not mean that the CEO said, oh, this is really important, I support you, but they are actually part of the team wherever possible, so that you really have that kind of presence of a management team member. Doesn't mean they sit in every check-in and they do kind of the OKR planning and the administration in the tool, but really that they have a certain resource capacity for execution as well. At least that's what's been successful in a couple of clients I work with. And last but not least, to really think about that what you're doing there might be a massive change process for your organization, especially if you come from a rather functional structure. So really cater towards that. So invest in training and preparation, in a good setup for the onboarding. Work with roles and responsibilities that can help the teams, either being OKR coaches or team coaches or something like that. And really think about the individual change journeys that brings into place as well, either being for the leaders or the team members or people that now have responsibility in different teams where they first were only part of one team and so on. And now you can, of course, look at that and say, okay, this is a lot of work. There are a lot of challenges. Yes, there are potential solutions, but is that really worth it? And so let me end that with, why is that worth it and how can that look like? So for me, it brings out 4 things for these development topics. First of all, it really raises awareness for the overarching priority because you put it on the agenda, you recruit people, you let them go through a process, and you have kind of an effect that spreads throughout the organization just by that. You have a lot more proactive engagement for the topic when you build it like that, and you start to build actual shared responsibility beyond the functional structures or dedicated positions, even if you have a sustainability officer, but that's not what shared responsibility is like. So this is one piece of the puzzle, or it might be to help you really build shared responsibility. And it shouldn't be overlooked that it enhances the visibility for the priority quite a bit. So to give you one concrete example from one of my clients is when we do, for example, OKR alignment workshops. So the formats where different OKR teams come together to align their goals, look at the priorities, see if everything together goes in the right direction. I love to do that with the 3D worlds. If you're not familiar with them, it's a great tool to visualize complex matters and complex connections. So I think it's perfect for things like OKR alignment. And here you have 2 effects. First of all, the people from these teams, they are already present. So you have a lot more visibility just through the presence of more people, instead of just having one little piece for a goal within an HR department somewhere that gets lost. And especially with visual tools like that, you can even enhance the visibility by making that priority even more clear. So for example, what we did here, when we mapped out the different priorities and the connections towards each other, we, in this case, choose these little trees as a symbol for sustainability to check back on, okay, the OKRs that we have in our organization, how many of them are really related towards this strategic priority? And then you quickly get an overview whether this is only true for the goals that this particular team set, or do we have relations regarding the OKRs from other teams as well? And you can quickly engage in discussion. where are we right now regarding that? Is that where we want to be, or what can we or do we need to change in the future to make sure that this spreads a little more? And so, for example, with this client, what we saw over the last couple of OKR cycles is that there a lot more trees popped up here and there because the other teams also started to think about this priority, and kind of the responsibility spread throughout the different OKR teams. So these 4 topics, I would say, are already important, but a 5th one, I think, is also important when it comes to these development topics, and that is when you start to work with dedicated OKRs for these, you start to shift the conversation from what to why. So what do I mean with that? When you look at a lot of the discussions around sustainability or DEI or and also the studies, for example, it's a lot about what organizations actually do. So do they have a strategy? Do they have events? Do they have policies? Did they change their job ads and so on? But it's a lot less about what is then the change we're actually after, the thing that we can see in our organization, and what is then really our why behind we want to do that. And so if you start to use OKRs for that, you kind of nicely start to force yourself to think more in that direction. So meaning you go away from just talking about a sustainability event, a DEI newsletter, or a meditation tool, and force yourself to think about, okay, what is then the change that I'm actually after? Because this is what you need to put into your objective. So is it about personal sustainability goals from each employee? What kind of change in behavior do you want to see in your recruiting process and so on? And then again, connected to your definition of success, what does that then mean for us? Is it about enhanced profitability? Is it about future-proofing society? Or what are we actually after? And when you start to bring all that together, you really change the narrative of the discussion from what do you need to do more into what's the change you're after and why do you want to do it? And that really enhances not just the progress in that area, but how people start to talk, to think about, and to act about that topic. And to bring it up in a nutshell, I think there is a lot of unused potential when it comes to organizational development and these topics around OKRs. So I would always argue to first test and adapt your shared definition of success and what that actually means for your organization, for your team, for yourself. Check who you optimize your goals for. Well, what is the group that is mainly in the driver's seat for that? Clearly define your OKR why, and then intentionally design your OKR system accordingly and look at all the variations, not just the standard version. And then also start to experiment with overarching OKRs and virtual teams for these strategic focus and development topics. And then, of course, inspect and adapt as you need. And to round it up, I said earlier that if you haven't started with OKRs, this is the perfect starting point, because I think if you start your OKR implementation with creating these virtual teams around the development topic and not start with functional OKRs, it brings 3 things. First of all, people see and experience a real change, so they can really feel that the way that we work with goals is something new that has a tremendous effect. They experience the power and the benefits of OKRs, because if, for example, your OKR implementation focuses a lot on cross-functional collaboration, that's what you live in these virtual teams, so people can feel that something shifts towards that desired benefit. And you start to think a lot more in overarching goals, in a shared definition of success, and that brings you a lot closer towards the shared understanding of what you value and how you then need to optimize your goal setting towards that definition of success. Thanks a lot, and now I'm really eager to hear your questions and your comments about that.
So if anybody has a question, then you can ask. Okay, go ahead.
Can I just ask straight away?
Yes, totally.
All right. Thank you for your talk. It was super interesting. Now, I would like to know more about one part that you mentioned. You said that leadership should be on board in the truest sense of the word, them being part of the team. And I wonder how that shifts the team dynamic. Because sometimes there might be a tendency, everybody looking towards the CEO and might not be comfortable raising concerns in that environment.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I think it really depends also on what kind of culture around leadership and collaboration you have in a company. So I've seen exactly that happen, what you said. The CEO came in also more with the attitude of, okay, let's get things done, but still in a mode of delegating. People didn't speak up and all these kind of side effects you have there. Then, of course, you might really think, is that the right balance? Does it really kind of cater towards that need? Or are we then better, met with just him or her being a sponsor or something like that? So I would say, pay close attention to where is this organization at, and is this a good idea at this moment in time, or do you maybe need to start with a smaller approach? But I think it can also be, especially if it's not, let's say it's an important topic, but it's nothing super business critical at this moment in time, then I think it can also be kind of a great playground to start interacting differently, or at least working towards interacting differently from a leadership side, but also from an employee side. But I think there it can be really important, for example, to have a team coach or anybody else as a support function to really look at into these different dynamics. But it's definitely not something that works in every organization at every point in time, but maybe something that you can at least strive towards. And one thing that is particularly important for me, or that I kind of set as a mandatory prerequisite, is if members of the management team take up this responsibility, they need to be really serious about that, because I've seen it so often that you agree on that, you commit to that, and then at the end of the cycle in the reflection, teams tell me, well, he was never there, he didn't really execute, he only delegated, and so on. And then it has, of course, the totally reverse effect. So I think you need to be really clear with your management team. Is this something that they can commit to and they're willing to change? If not, then please take another approach.
Thank you.
Yeah, you may just ask.
Yeah, I have another question. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. So you mentioned that in the OKR teams, you want people to volunteer. So what do you do in an organization if no one volunteers, or you have like one or two, like not enough to form a team?
Yeah, also a very good point. First of all, what I like about volunteering is it also shows me where are we currently at regarding that priority. Because especially with topics like sustainability or mental health, it's really easy to say, oh, this is important, we need to do something about that. But if nobody signs up to actually do something about that, I mean, that's a pretty clear statement per se, right? And then I need to, I would say, engage in a discussion in terms of how clear have we been? What kind of roadblocks or impediments do we have? Is it a resource issue? Is it an awareness issue? Where are we currently at? At the same time, if only 2 people sign up, you always have the possibility to then put your OKRs kind of in a way that kind of serves that. For example, you can start with 2-3 people setting one OKR set just to create more awareness about this priority. That can already be kind of a next step. Of course, you have to dial down your goals, but I would always use it as a feedback tool, because once you make it mandatory, you will kind of miss the opportunity to actually get this feedback. Where do we currently stand and what do we need to do as a next step?
Yeah, thanks.
I have also a question, so thanks a lot also from my side. It was very interesting. I remember that triangle you showed at the beginning, where you showed where we had the discussion what goal means for people, people, product, or profit oriented. So now I would assume that in a company we have some kind of distribution, what matters to people in regards to these 3 areas, or even more, even also to the purpose. No? So if now the company on a top level side would have mostly profit as goals, which I see very often, neglect the other topics, I mean, would the OKR method help in this place? So I would assume that it needs some kind of balance to address people also.
So if I understood your question correctly, is that you often see that kind of the top level has a rather strong priority in terms of a profit direction of success, and other parts of the company might have a different view? Did I get that right?
I believe that people in general have, you can find all these 3 areas. So. And I think people are present in these companies, maybe in a similar distribution.
Yeah. First of all, I would totally agree with that. Certainly, you never have a company where people all think alike. But the question is, what is then still the decision? What we prioritize most? And do we actually reflect that in how we're acting? So for me, it's also kind of a question of consistency in terms of, do we walk our talk when it comes to what do we actually value? Because I don't think there's any point in saying we're super social and we're kind of working towards our purpose, but then having goals that solely represent kind of the profit point of view. And I think there OKRs and methods like that can already help to make that visible and then start to have a discussion. What do we do with this inconsistency? Is that okay? Do we need to add something? Or do we then just need more transparency around what we actually value? Because I think, first of all, it's a really important information for people working at that company. What is then, when it comes to the edge, actually the priority, and how do we act around that? To also adjust their behavior or their thinking around that. And on the other hand, it sometimes opens up a space to then think about, okay, yes, we're mainly profit driven, but we also have other priorities. We just somehow are not used to having them represented in our goals, and we want to get better around that. So I think opening up these discussion spaces is really important, but then at the same time also being honest about yourself. And I think that's something that many organizations are really uncomfortable with that level of honesty in terms of, if this is what we want, if this is what we value, then this is the consequence, and that's totally okay. Which does not mean that parts of the organization cannot maybe have a slightly different view on things, but at the end, this will be a decision criteria no matter what. And maybe to give you an example from the client I talked about that made the decision that sustainability and profitability are kind of on the same level, it took them a while to actually start to act in a way that mirrors that priority that they set kind of written down in their strategy, because they were also so used to always acting in favor of the profitability. But then people started to point that out more and more because we had that represented also in the goals, like, for example, with these little trees. And then it became very obvious that actually there was a big discrepancy between what we say and what we do. And then we could start to change that. So I would always, plea for honesty, even if it's uncomfortable, because I think it opens rooms for different solutions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have another question. My first contact with OKRs was through Andy Grove's book, High Output Management, and also through Google's approach. And if I remember that correctly, both advocate the use of OKRs where where you're in a good place when you even achieve 70% of the goal. Mm-hmm. Now, I wonder, I have a feeling, and from my experience with OKR, this is culturally maybe not a very good fit in Europe. What are your experiences with these kinds of? Yes,
I would say there's this kind of, a fairy tale OKR version, especially the one of Google. If you say, oh, this is what worked for them, now we're going to do it exactly the same way. And there again, totally neglecting the reality. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of stretch goals, of ambitious goals, of having goals rather as a means of learning, of communication, of development, than focusing solely on the goal achievement. But I'm also a fan of finding pragmatic solutions for the reality. And if the reality is that you come from 50 years of company culture where 100% goal achievement is the key thing and always the goal and what you're measured on, then you will not change that overnight just because you do OKRs. And so my experience is that most companies need at least a transition period when they change from this very linear goal achievement state into having goals more as a learning and development instrument. And kind of speaking of this, 70% is already great. It's a leadership journey, it's a change journey, and so on. And this will take a while. And there again, this needs to be reflected in the structures, in the behavior of the leaders, in the performance management, in HR processes, and so on. So it's a lot bigger topic than simply saying, oh, OKR should be 70% achieved, and now let's do that. So it's a lot more complex. And I think you need to cater towards that complexity by giving organizations time, but also setting realistic goals. And so, for example, one thing that I often do with teams that start off new on that journey is to say, we aim for ambitious goals, but let's, for example, pick one. So if they, for example, have 3 OKR sets, 2 are more in the direction of, yeah, this is kind of what we want to achieve and we have to achieve. But then we have one area where we really can set a moonshot, an ambitious goal and try that out. That sometimes works well for them to at least start to move in that direction. But here, I think it's really key to have realistic expectations that we cannot just move from one to the other, and especially not just by changing the headline.
Great, thanks.
All right, then, Natalia, thank you very much for the presentation. That brings us to the end of today. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And now we have the conference closing and the donation handover. So, thank you. Goodbye.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Let's connect and keep talking. And I wish you a wonderful day and weekend.